Let's talk about Europe and India. The two are trying to change with the changing world order, but the change isn't without hiccups. Europe had slammed India for its neutral stance towards the war in Ukraine. And now that the continent is finding itself increasingly isolated, it is looking to restart talks. And now India is in a position to say, "We told you so." Keeping the pettiness aside, let's ask some questions as we always do. Does Europe need India's help to end the Ukraine war? Can Europe and India find their place in the Trumpian world? And should the world learn India's way of diplomacy? I'm Ananya Dutta. Let's get some answers. You know, it's been 60 years since India first assigned its ambassador to the European Economic Community. New Delhi was unsure at the time, trying to move away from the British colonial era. Things obviously changed drastically. India is not a protectionist economy anymore. It's worth $3.5 trillion, is part of the crucial groups like G20 and Quad, and is now emerging as a global power. Things were off to a good start in 2000s with the first EU-India summit. The ties soon transformed into a strategic partnership. There were some roadblocks with trade, but as they say, friendship and fights go hand in hand. However, the real bump in the road came when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Ever since the war broke out, the EU and the US have been rallying India to condemn Russia's move. While the EU Commission chief was subtle in her criticism, then US President Joe Biden singled out India.
The outcome of the war will not only determine the future of Europe, but also deeply affect the Indo-Pacific region and the rest of the world. For the Indo-Pacific region, it is as important as for Europe that borders are respected.
The Quad is, with the possible exception of India being somewhat shaky on some of this, but Japan has been extremely strong, so has Australia, in terms of dealing with Putin's aggression.
But India did not jitter. The Prime Minister was very categorical in his approach to the war, where he talked about dialogue and not the blame game. The country's position has been on full display at the United Nations. New Delhi has abstained from every single resolution that condemned Russia for invading Ukraine. And to prove a point, the foreign minister has shown a mirror to the West.
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems. But the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That if it is you, it's yours. If it is me, it's ours. I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept that.
India's balancing act isn't unfounded. Russia is India's largest supplier of major arms. In the face of Western sanctions, Russia has also given discounted oil to India, something that has greatly benefited New Delhi. But it's a balancing act, as I said. India has also provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine throughout the last 3 years. In fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was one of the two world leaders who visited both Kiev and Moscow since the onset of the war. The world looks very different today. Even the best of the analysts fail to predict that one day the US will abandon its Eurocentric foreign policy. Donald Trump has left its allies behind and cut all funding to Ukraine. Whether Europe should have seen this coming or not is probably for another episode. But it seems like Europe has realized that it cannot rely solely on the US anymore. So it's stretching its arms towards India. The President of the European Commission and all her fellow commissioners turned up in India last week in a hastily put together visit. The bonhomie on display sent out the message that Europe still has friends.
The timing is, of course, important. We've seen that Europe's ties with its closest ally, the United States, are currently under unprecedented strain. The transatlantic alliance is now fundamentally under question. Europe's relations with China as well, which is the EU's top trading partner, have also recently been at a historic low. And this is prompting the EU to expand its other partnerships, and India currently seems to be at the top of the agenda.
And the bone of contention, the Ukraine war, was hardly mentioned. A statement released after the meeting mentioned Ukraine only in one paragraph. It broadly talks about a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. The leaders did a good job of sticking to the bits both agree on when it comes to the war. So the meeting wasn't exactly about Ukraine. It was about the Trumpian world, where long-standing foreign policy can change after just one press conference. And at a time when Trump is launching multiple trade wars, Europe and India are finalizing a free trade deal. Reports say Europe is much more accommodating this time.
We have tasked our teams to build on this momentum and finalize our free trade agreement before the end of the year. We're expecting a lot of our trade negotiators. We told them they should surprise us. Now more than ever, the geopolitical content asks for decisive action.
Don't get us wrong. We're not saying that Europe wouldn't have signed a free trade agreement with India had Trump not been in the White House. But the difference is that the EU chief now speaks of trade and geopolitics in the same breath.
Well, there certainly was initial disappointment in Europe on India's position. Europe, since then, though, has tried to understand India's security compulsions, India's dependency on Russian military equipment, and also the strengthening Russia-China axis, which is of concern to India. So despite the EU and India's divergences when it comes to Russia and the Ukraine war, I think the frequency and quality of interactions between Europe and India has in fact substantially increased in recent years.
India and Europe might still not agree on their respective visions for the world order, but their differences seem to be pale in a world where the very presence of any order is doubtful. Europe and India have so much to work with. India could be a bridge with Russia. The EU could extend regional security in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, there's Donald Trump in the White House. You know, the EU chief's keynote speech in New Delhi was titled The Consequential Partnership, Reimagining and Realigning EU-India Ties for Today's World. At a time when Trump is behaving like it's his world and we're all just living in it, a consequential partnership sounds just about right.